I'm going to take you on a trip here. I'm going to start off, first of all, I want to ultimately educate you on opportunities that come out of the space technology and are then commercialized, and kind of the track I took. But I was actually criticized by my father not long ago, and he heard one of my speeches, and he says, you know, your problem is that you don't establish any of your own credibility. And so I'm now going to change it. This is the first time I've ever done this. But let's just see how it goes. Okay, I started off like, you know, look at that date there, 1987. And I started doing hostile takeovers. I was in a room as a board member of Mesa Petroleum when my dad was doing all of his hostiles, and I was just sitting in on it. And I was looking around the room, and I was like, there's my lawyer, there's my analyst, there's my accounting firm, there's, gosh, I can do a takeover. You know, as long as I, you know, find the opportunity, you know, there's my financing over there. So I went and I started doing takeovers of something that was very, very easy to do, which were closed-end funds that were selling at about a 30 or 40% discount to their net asset values. If anybody knows about closed-end funds, they're just, you know, like a mutual fund, except they're in a corporate format where they have the shares that are outstanding are static. A mutual fund, you'll always have vacillating, oscillating shares outstanding, and so it's always meeting its net asset value at a 1-to-1 ratio. When you don't have the shares that end up, you know, oscillating due to the supply and demand, then you can get a discount on them. And I'm sitting there looking at them going, Japan Fund is the first one that I started out, and that had a $600 million net asset value, and then it had about a $450 million market cap on it. So anyway, that was Forbes back in the day, and I just kind of kept going along. I just kind of slipped through this stuff just to kind of show you. I hope this establishes credibility, because that's what I'm trying to do. I then took over a company that was called Catalyst Energy Corporation. It was a $2.5 billion asset corporation that I bought for a deep discount after the management decided they'd give themselves 90% of the net income that year in bonuses. The stock price went from $24 to $3, and but the value of the company was, you know, probably $24. So I went in and I bought it for $11 a share, and then I came in, and about that time was when the SEC asked me over to the federal courthouse in New York City, and they said, we're going to investigate everything that you've done here with this acquisition of this company. And I said, I haven't done anything wrong. And they said, it doesn't matter. We're now sending the message off that the Reagan administration believes that you're upsetting the capital markets, and they don't like you hostile people. You're now the son of a hostile guy, and we certainly don't want this now shifting to the new generation. So I looked at my attorney, and he says the game's up. And I said, oh, crap. Wow. So that's when I slipped into this company that I had just acquired, and the financing, and I said, I'm 28 years old, but I think I can handle it, and can I go and run this company? It was had about $550 million in sales, $2.5 billion in net assets, and a lot of debt. So I went in and restructured the company, and one of the things that we found in there was a power plant that we could build on the Mississippi River. It was, at the time, it was targeted for a 5-megawatt plant that was kind of in the sleuth gate system. And I went in there and sat down with the general of the Corps of Engineers and talked to them and talked him into 502 CFS, or cubic feet per second, which ended up being a 200-megawatt plant. So it turned in from a $30 million plant potential into a $500 million plant potential, and we made a lot of money on that one. And we floated up, and one of the things we did to make it really economical, we built it in the Avondale shipyards in New Orleans. Nobody's ever done that before with a power plant, and then we shipped it up the Mississippi River, and then we put it into a civil site that was waiting for it in Concordia Parish, Louisiana. I remember them coming in to me and telling me, you're going to have to get insurance on this. And I'm like, why? I mean, it's floating up the Mississippi River. And they said, well, you know, because the financing is going to make you do it. I said, how much is it? And they said, it's going to be $7 million. And I'm like, I'm not going to pay $7 million to float something up a river for 2 weeks. This is ridiculous. It got hit by a tornado on the way up. I mean, I buy insurance all the time now. You never know. So anyway, I went, and part of that acquisition, here's Arizona, is we ended up buying a 244 megawatt plant that was in Four Corners called San Juan. And then we also had the Somerville plant, which is another 248 megawatt plant. And this is a big power company that we acquired for a really big discount. Well, anyway, that's kind of how it goes, and it goes on and on and on and on, and different things I've done. I rolled up 114 water companies down in the southeast called U.S. Utilities, and sold it to a Dutch utility. They could have done it, they just didn't. You know, anybody could have gone out and bought these water utilities. It was the last piece of water utilities that were still held in private hands in a large accumulated area that you could service very efficiently. And so I sold off all the assets of Catalyst Energy and and we identified the opportunity, and I went down there and just started a company and bought them all up and sold it out to a Dutch utility. And then I wanted to go back home, so Austin is where you go if you're in Texas. You don't go back where I grew up, which was Amarillo, Texas, that's for sure. And so, you've been there? I'm so sorry. And, you know what Amarillo was kind of a funny story, is that its largest employer was Pantex, and Pantex is the final assembly plant of all nuclear arms in the Western world. In other words, they screw on the nuke in Amarillo. And I know the DOD flew around and probably looked at different sites, and they got out and they went, yeah, this could go. Nobody would know the difference. It's as flat as it gets. There's not a tree that's an indigenous tree unless somebody planted it. It's absolutely just terrible. 3,500 feet up, it's just, it's just terrible. So anyway, now this gets into what I want to talk about, so I'll knock off all this stuff. All right, so what happened in this case is that I got to Austin, Texas, and I was consulting with a bunch of new players in the world called hedge funds. And the hedge funds, while, I've been around for a long time and I'd seen a lot, and my dad always exposed us as children into his world, because that is him. He is business. He's not a guy who sits around and, watches movies or read books. He does business, and he always has. So you're invariably never really on a vacation. You're on a business trip that you happen to be asked to go along. So, and he would be good about that. He would bring us in. I do the same thing with my kids do. I'd bring them in and say, shut up, sit on the side, and listen, and maybe learn something. Here I am at 10, 11 years old, impatient as hell. But what do? You absorb some of that somewhere along the line. And I have to give that to my dad. That was really, a real special introduction into business, and I always loved it. And I call myself a genetic entrepreneur. I never even there was never even hey, what am I going to be when I grow up? I mean, I always knew that I was going to be an entrepreneur, and I started businesses as a kid, and some of them worked, some of them didn't, and then I started a company when I was in college called Beta Computer Systems, and we ended up having a program that would transfer really ugly bank data into a spreadsheet that was called at the time VisiCalc. And no one had that. I mean, it seems simple today. You dump it in, you put it into a file format, and it goes in there, and that's what it's done. But not back then. These big mainframes had either tape drives or 8-inch drives, and how are you going to get that over to a little PC? So I had to take an 8-inch drive, and then I had to take a 5 1/4-inch drive, and then I had to put a transfer. How do you take this, ugly mainframe data and put it into a VisiCalc format? And I made a lot of money doing it. I was a senior in high school, in college, and I think the first year I made $830,000 the first year off of Betacom, was the transfer. And we were killing it. We were in Dallas, Texas, and I was over at the Federal Reserve. I was over at all the banks that later went broke. And so it was just a good business, and I really never had to use any of my family's money, and I still haven't used any of my family's money, because I sold the company for $2 million a year out of college, and that was enough to get you started, to get going. It was kind of my growth stake, and so I moved on from there, and that's when I started doing the closed-end funds, and I made a lot of money on that, and then I went into the Catalyst, and I made a whole lot of money on that, and it's just kind of gone on. Now the hedge fund guys are coming in, and I go look at them, and I'm like, you little boys. Good luck to you. And since then, that has then, of course, we've seen how they've performed, and they were young. They came out of good training, typically a Bear Stearns or a Morgan Stanley trading group. They had a good track record, but they had an infrastructure behind them, and they would get into things that they should not get into. In the case of this, they had gotten into a company that was called Mirant, and they asked me to come in because of my power background. And Mirant was a $14 billion bankruptcy that was out of the Southern companies out of Georgia. They had spun it off as their independent power group, and that's what Catalyst was an independent power company as well. And they had blown it. I mean, they're utility people trying to run an entrepreneurial company. It never works. And they went bankrupt. Well, now they had project debt on everything. All the project debt went down the tubes. And I was asked to come in by some hedge fund people that I'd introduced myself to that I can't talk about still. And they had taken way too big of a position in both the debt, and it was the junior debt. It was super inexpensive, and then also the equity in a bankruptcy. Equities usually was zero, and so suddenly you know, I went in and looked at them and said, what are you people doing? I mean, you haven't even analyzed this. You don't even know what a power company is. And, well, I don't know, you know, it seems like the place to go. There's a lot of liquidity, you know. Well, because people wanted to sell is why there's liquidity, you know. So what do you want me to do? And they said, well, you know, can you go in here and try to represent our interest on the credit committees or on the equity committee? And I went on the credit committee, and there's already people there that were really well qualified on the credit committee that was representing them. And so I didn't want to muscle my way in. But the equity committee, I looked there, and there was an analyst on the equity committee that was approved by the courts, and it was a friend of mine that came out of Peter J. Solomon, and he was really, really a fantastic analyst that came out of GE Financial. And I called him up, and I said, you know, what do you see here? And he goes, I think there's money in this thing. And I was like, well, you know, there typically is. He goes, I'm telling you, I think after you pay off the debt and all the accrued interest, I think there's some bucks in here. I said, okay, I'm coming up to New York, let's go have a look. So I went up there and we sat down, and I came out of there and I said, I think there's $16 billion in value in this thing after the smoke clears, and I think we owe them $14 billion in the debt with accrued interest in it. And I said, there's $2 billion sitting here in the equity, and the price of the stock on the market, on the stock exchange, the whole market cap was like $40 million. So I was like, I think these guys may have slipped into something. So I went back to them and I said, okay, I want in. And they said, yeah. You know, like all these guys, you know, they don't brush their teeth, they oil them. And they saw me as like, you know, now wanting something. You know, before they were asking me, now I wanted to go do this because I got all excited after talking to my buddy. And I I just showed a little bit too much enthusiasm. I look back at that now and I'm like, I'll never do that. And they said, okay, we want you to do this Space Hab thing. We want you to do a hostile takeover on Space Hab. I go, Space Hab? What the hell's that? They said it's this company, and they, you know, oh, they have a lawsuit with NASA, and they're going to get $87 million, and there's a $20 million market cap on it. I'm like, this is terrible. I go, you don't want to do a hostile takeover on an itty bitty company with $6 million in cash. The lawyers will just eat it all up. It'll go away in a half a second. It's like, no, that's what we want to do. So I said, no, you guys calm down. All right, look, I'll be back to you. I want to do some due diligence on Space Hab. So I went back and I got Capital IQ all fired up, and I looked at it, and it was terrible. And it was, you know, they had lost in what they call 107, which was STS space, or it was a space shuttle STS 107, and it crashed, and that's Columbia. In the back of that, in the back bay, was a module that Space Hab was in the business of essentially renting to NASA that had science in it. And it was big. It was, you know, this big, and, you know, and it sat in those back big bay, and it had a tunnel that went up to the mid-deck, and the astronauts could come back in there, and they would manipulate the science, and Space Hab would lease that to them whenever they needed to do that. Well, in the meantime, NASA's giving out money, what they call the Centers of Excellence, and it went out to universities that were politically placed. If you ever look at the 7 Centers of Excellence, it's not a mistake why they got the money at all. It was like every single one of them on the Science and Technology Committee, on the Senate and the Congress side, you would look at it and you'd go, well, of course, that's where the universities are, the people that are appropriating money to NASA. You know, I don't like seeing that kind of thing, but it was like there, and you're like, oh, okay. Now they're giving money to the Centers of Excellence of those PIs, of those the PhDs would put it into the proposals, and then NASA would approve them under this peer process that was squirrely. And then they would give money, and they gave out $750 million of money out of NASA into these Centers of Excellence, and then those experiments would go up to microgravity in the Space Hab module that was in the back, and then we would train the astronauts, and they would go back and they manipulate all these experiments, and they would make like, you know, $50–60 million, Space Hab would, every time they flew, and they usually flew about every 1.5 years. And so here's a company who just kind of has a, you know, a coupon with this, you know, system that they have, and NASA's over there, you know, paying them money. It was a good business. Now it crashes.
Well, I can speak to how good it was before it crashed, because
it was fascinating. It was a great program. It was a guy
Right.
named, it was two entrepreneurs. It was a guy named Kistler, who was a well-known entrepreneur that was in the early days of the space industry. And there was another, Mr. Cisco, and he was, is that right? I'm wrong on that last name, but he was kind of an attorney that worked with him. And they were the entrepreneurs. They started the company. They got the franchise with NASA, everything, the contracts and all the stuff that they had to do, which took them forever. And then they handed it over to these administrator guys that just did it for 25 years. It was a 25-year program, and we flew 24 flights in 25 years. So these guys just administrated it. Entrepreneurs are long gone, and as I say, the entrepreneurs start them and the administrators finish them off. So they were being finished off at this point. Now it crashes, and now they go sue NASA. You know, they still had another science module that they could continue to fly in the shuttle. It wasn't like they only had one, and they sued their only. Who else is going to use a science module that would go back in the back of a bay of a space shuttle? You know, that'd be one customer, and you wouldn't sue your one customer. You don't sue NASA. I mean, that's like a family over there. It's like a collegiate family. You don't sue NASA. These guys sue NASA. So now these, you know, these young hedge fund guys that have way too much money invest in a lawsuit, is essentially what it is. You invest in a lawsuit? You gotta be kidding. That's the worst investment in the world. You go either way. You know, go get a quarter. You know, I'll see how it works out in court. You know, and you guys are now on a 50-50 bet perhaps. I go in there, analyze the lawsuit. I get the right attorneys and they have a look at it and they're like, you know, it's going over to, you know, the Justice Department. And once it gets it goes into the Justice Department, it comes off of NASA's budget. So NASA doesn't even have to spend any money to defend this lawsuit. The JD will do that for them. And they are gods at just like taking forever and ever because that's what they do really well. Now you're over on the private sector paying these guys $3.5 million a year with a company that had $6 million in cash, and you're like, this ain't gonna work out. So I go back to the guys that are at the hedge fund and I said, you guys, this thing's just done. I mean, it's over with. They got $82 million in debt on the thing, and they owe $4.5 million to EADS every year for a sale leaseback they never should have done a long time ago, and they've got this lawsuit. I'm not going to go do a hostile takeover on this. Well, we're not going to give you Mirren. I'm like, okay. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go on the board. So he said, okay, go on the board. I said, okay, fine. That's a compromise. Everybody's happy. So I went on the board over there. They forced themselves on the board. They went in and talked to the board of directors and said, you know, or else, because they own such a big chunk of the company. So they put me on the board, and I sat there on the board. It was just like, you know, scratching my fingers across an old blackboard. It was just awful. You know, these guys. I said, well, you're going to lose your contract with NASA. They've already told you that the contract is over in August of 07. This is 04. What are you going to do? You got a couple of years to think about it and reinvent yourself. You know, what are you going to do? You're going to fly the shuttle, you know, another 3 times. You're going to end up making, you know, $50-60 million maybe. And so what are you going to do? And they had, you know, everybody and their uncle hired in this company. It was way overstaffed. And they came up and they said, well, you know, we pay $12.50 for our bunny suits to be cleaned in our clean room. And I'm like, oh no. And they said, yeah, we're thinking about putting in. I'm like, you don't want to come from the space industry to a dry cleaner. You know, that's, you know, this is a terrible idea. And that was their best idea how they were going to reinvent themselves. I mean, it was terrible. So I said, okay, fellas, I want to start a thing called the Market Opportunity Committee. I'll be the chair of it, and I'm going to go fly around the world when I have time, and I'm going to go to a bunch of conferences in the space industry, and I'm going to teach myself this industry and figure out where I can find something out there. And I spent about a year, you know, when I had time, I'd go off to this and that and the other. And I found it was a cost plus, conference every single time. It was the government paying Boeing 6.5%, 7%, 8% on top of their cost. And then Raytheon got it, and then Lockheed got it, and Ball Aerospace got it. You know, it's all that happening in the space industry. You go to a conference, you're basically looking at a cost plus industry. And I'm looking for the entrepreneurial something in there to go reinvent ourselves into, acquire or expand or something. And it's just like not anywhere. I'm not seeing anything anywhere at all. That whole industry is completely, totally financed 100% by the United States government. So I was coming up with, you know, hey, well, why don't we go back and look at the science? We flew 1,613 experiments in these things. $750 million was spent by NASA. There's got to be something in there. You can't spend $750 million and end up with zero. I don't know. You can't. I don't know. It might be worth $750 million. Might be worth $10, but you're going to have something that's worth more than just zero. So I went through all of these experiments, and I found out that the experiments that would work. I found one that was really cool that I liked a lot because the power business is they had a ball bearing that if you grew up in microgravity because you don't have any gravity bias, it would turn something like 700,000 RPM, where the fastest that you could ever turn one on Earth is 63,000 RPM. And I thought, well, you put that on every armature of every power plant of everywhere in the world, and maybe you can get greater efficiencies out of it, and then that would be a valuable thing that you could go make in space. And I found, and then I went to Bechtel, who I'd worked with forever, and you guys run the numbers on this thing. What are my efficiencies if I could run the ball bearing that fast, and blah, blah, blah. And they came back and they said, yeah, you'd get about a 1.7% efficiency. And that's a lot. I mean, with a power plant just sitting there turning, 24/7, that can add up to a whole lot. And then after we retrofitted and we went through all of them, it would cost this much. And we worked out all the matrix of it and put it in a spreadsheet and had to look at it. And it was, all of a sudden you get back to how much does it cost to send things up to space and bring them back down again, and it was $30,000 a kilogram, and it didn't work at all. I mean, it just didn't work. I mean, you weren't even close. So it needed to be something like $3,000 a kilogram to give you some, it was 10 times too expensive. So I thought, what it is who's making money in space? Oh, that'd be those ComSat guys. And they're sending up something very lightweight, a microwave, and they're bouncing it off, and it's very low value when it goes. It's very high value when it comes down. Okay, you want low value, lightweight, hit something, come down, that's my model. So I took this 1,613 experiments and I said, I don't want anything in materials at all. Nothing that goes up there and then I have to keep going up there and coming back and coming back. How about go up there and get information and then come back down with it one time? And that went into the biotech area. So I started looking at the biotech and I said, what do we have here? And there was really three things in biotech. One of them is that they found out that vaccines could be made from a biomarker that expresses itself in microgravity. And that's the one I pursued, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And the other one was protein crystals, which when you're trying to do a new drug development, you'll grow a crystal around a protein, and then you'll end up doing X-ray crystallography, which diffracts off of it, and then you can find what the atomic structure is, and then you can go and put together a polymer that will end up being attracted to that protein, and then when you attract yourself to the protein, then you can do things with it from a medical standpoint. That's the simple answer to it. I'm sure all you medical guys know that I just kind of got that right. So anyway, but these crystals are very valuable, and what they do on Earth is you have a gravity bias on the crystals. The crystals end up, the clarity of those crystals is not that great, but when they send them up into space on some experiments they did, they were fantastic, and then they can get a better construct of the protein when they use those crystals that they grow in space. I didn't choose to do that at the time because those crystals need a real quiet place to grow. And at the time, they were still constructing the International Space Station. It had about 2 years to go on it. And when you're slamming in, the Japanese Kibo and the European Columbus, that whole station will vibrate for hours. And so I didn't like that. And also, they're packing it and they're getting it ready for, for the completion of the station, which happened in December of 2011. And I wanted it to be a quiet station who had fallen into melancholy rather than, because those crystals are, you don't want to be messing with the growth of the crystals. That. So it just wasn't an environment for it. While the microbes that I chose that you could do, it only needed 6 days on orbit. It means I didn't even have to take it out of the shuttle. I didn't have to disturb all what was going on in the construction of the skyscraper up there. I could leave it down in there, and all I had to do was just crank it, have an astronaut crank it 2 times, and I was good. It was super simple, and that's about all they could handle given their manifest of responsibilities that they had on orbit at the time. So anyway, that company I created out of that, and I got the PI that worked on it that NASA had sent up there 7 times before that, Tim Hammond, and I got him, and we all collaborated together, and we started sending up, and I have sent up a dozen of those. Now, I'll tell you before I run this movie, which is an interesting movie, the deal is this. When they sent up microbes up to space, oddly enough, no one really knows why. There's a couple of theories that are kind of fun to think about, but whatever. But it's a phenomenon, like many things are phenomena. And it ends up growing a lot more virulent, or a lot stronger when they send it up there. And not only a little stronger, like 100 times stronger. Now, NASA would consider that to be a big issue, because if you're flying somebody to Mars, which is 8 months there and 8 months back and a year on planet, well then any kind of infection is going to happen. In that 3-year period of time, there is going to be infection. And if it's 100 times stronger and your immune system is already being compromised in microgravity for various reasons, and all of a sudden you have a 100 times stronger infectious disease, biological infectious disease, you can kill everybody. They all come back dead. So that's a big deal in NASA, so they kept pouring money into it, and they kept making sure that they were flying those experiments. And so they did so, and I came in there because in 2004, after Columbia went down, they took all the money away from the Centers of Excellence. There was no more money that was being applied into any of their research. And then they went off into what was called Moon, Mars, and Beyond, which is otherwise known as Constellation, that ended up being canceled last year, 2 years ago. So after they spent $9.5 billion as note. So anyway, they took all the money away from science. I came in there and rescued that science and said, okay, you know, this is cool. Somebody spent $750 million. I get to go through it as an entrepreneur, and I get to go cherry pick whatever is out there. It's kind of nice. So I went in and I found that one thing, and I said, you know, I'm going to go with this because it's easy to do on station right now, as I said earlier. And so I'm going to go now and see if I can't commercialize this. And so here is a really good little thing. Do we have sound?
No, I don't think we have sound.
We don't have sound.
Oh,
That's
no.
tough.
No.
Okay, we don't have sound. guys.
Well, try.
Maybe sound on here?
Let me see.
Tom, I've got some speakers you can use to plug into your computer.
Well, why don't we do that? I mean, I hate to kind of retrofit, but you know, that's kind of entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
There's a sound button right next to that.
Okay, but I think there's a system sound too. Okay,
Randy,
one
Where is some of
USB
those?
port. We don't need this
Oh,
anymore.
that's a good idea.
we have got to get more technically competent.
I know.
Technology what?
Got it right here.
Do you think they give you a laptop?
I know.
We have no technologists in the room.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, yeah. Those don't cost much.
No, no.
Aha, I found it. What I like.
Dropping a huge chunk of change.
No, no, it's easy to get
There,
those.
well, let's do it.
Thank you, Asher.